You are beneath the arena. The torchlight is low, the air tastes of damp stone and iron. Footsteps above are a distant, indifferent thunder. A narrow chamber opens before you, no more than a closet carved into the earth, its floor worn smooth by leaning bodies and shackles. Scratch marks score the walls, thumb-deep lines, names or prayers or nothing at all. Somewhere nearby, a ledger lies bound in oilskin, its pages weighted with numbers and terse entries. You can almost make out the shapes of letters, the practiced shorthand of inventory. If you believe hidden history deserves to be exposed, hit like and tell us where you're watching from, and stay until the end. What follows will make you look at Rome's grand monuments with different eyes. I have spent years reading the margins of empire, the dry pages of ancient chroniclers, the brittle fragments of ledgers that survived damp cellars, the reports of excavations under and around the great amphitheaters. What I'm about to show you is not a lurid tale pulled from rumor. It is a reconstruction built from sources, literary testimony, administrative records, and archaeology that, when joined, reveal a pattern. This pattern turns a celebrated spectacle into an administrative apparatus for human dispossession and, in many cases, sexual violence. Ancient writers record episodes. Archaeologists uncover the spaces that made them possible. Modern historians infer the institutional logic that tied both together. Where the evidence is thin, I will mark the claim as inference or plausible reconstruction. The first thing to understand is how conquest folded into spectacle. Rome's wars produced captives by the thousands. Ancient chroniclers describe convoys of the defeated, men in shackles, women led with veils torn or clinging, children trailing, households unmade. These captives entered a legal universe that stripped them of personhood. In Roman law, they were often classified as public slaves or part of the spoils of war. The distinctions mattered less to the people whose lives were catalogued on lists and parceled out. The language used in administrative records is telling: captiva, captivi, preda. The same technical vocabulary used for wagons, battalions, and livestock appears beside names that were once entire households. Archaeological evidence supports the bureaucratic quality of this human inventory. Excavations beneath several amphitheaters and near known ludus complexes have revealed storage rooms and small cells, dimensions consistent with holding human bodies. 10 to 15 square meters, niches for bedding, heavy iron rings set into stone at regular intervals. In one site, shards of pottery and fragments of textile have been found in a stratigraphic layer alongside tally marks scratched into plaster. In another, archaeologists uncovered wooden tablets with faded ink traces that appear to be lists, brief names, numerals, a shorthand notation that researchers interpret as transfers or payments. These are not isolated finds. They repeat across regions where the spectacle industrial complex took root. This system had a vocabulary of incentive. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners trained into public combatants. Ancient writers portray them ambivalently, admired for their daring, feared as instruments of violence, and envied for the favors they could win. The favor system, rewards granted to victorious fighters, has a public, performative dimension. A victor hailed in the arena might receive palm branches, monetary prizes, or even manumission. But the ledger entries and narrative fragments suggest a darker parallel practice: the allocation of captives as prizes in a more literal sense. Ancient chroniclers mention the practice in passing. The prosaic, almost bureaucratic way they do so hints that these were ordinary transactions, not exceptional outrages. Consider the ledgers. Where they survive and fragment, their columns are concise. A date or festival name, a unit or sponsor, a tally of names, a coded note of disposition. Modern historians have read these entries as accounting, notations of who was given to whom, under what terms. At points, the registers diverge from simple transfer and enter the language of rewards, words that can be translated as given, allocated, assigned. It is a small lexical shift, but it changes the moral geometry of what is recorded. When a gladiator is recorded as receiving a gift after a victory, the implication in certain contexts is that a person, often a captive woman, was included among the tokens. We can visualize one procedural moment without indulging in sensational detail. Imagine a ludus official, stern, leather-bound, accustomed to the economy of bodies, standing beside a ledger while a victorious fighter is presented in the shadow of the tunnel leading to the hypogeum. The official makes a terse notation. The ledger keeper murmurs the name of a captive. A chain of custody is recorded. The gladiator, for all the applause, is part of the same logistical chain that commodified human lives. This reconstruction is plausible given ledger entries and administrative practices recorded in other contexts. It should be read as an interpretive reconstruction anchored to documentary fragments, not as a verbatim eyewitness account. There are contemporary voices that corroborate the practice indirectly. Satirists and moralists of the imperial age, writers such as Juvenal and Martial among them, railed against the moral rot of spectacle culture. Their verses, often hyperbolic, reveal public familiarity with the sorts of transactions I am describing. They mock patrons who bid for novelty, complain about the mixing of levity and cruelty, and treat the spectacle's moral economy as both scandalous and ordinary. When a satirist sneers at a crowd buying more than games, it is not purely invective. It is testimony to a social practice woven into public life. The archaeology of the hypogeum, the underground network beneath the arena, matters precisely because architecture institutionalizes behavior. Above ground, the amphitheater is a theater of light, brightness, and civic celebration. Below, it is a network of corridors, holding pits, and chambers designed for rapid transfer, concealment, and staging. Stone benches, iron rings, and wooden shutters were not neutral features. They were instruments that shaped the possibilities of human action. A small tunnel could turn a captive into an object of display in minutes. Narrow cages and the proximity of animal enclosures created conditions where private cruelty could be rendered public by design, then hidden again. There is a human record cut into stone and plaster. Graffiti found near holding areas offers the most intimate traces of those who passed through. These are not literary monuments. They are the scrawled marks of people who scratched their names, their origins, fragmentary prayers, or bitter jokes. In one chamber, excavators found repeated marks, initials perhaps, overwritten by later hands. In another, a crude depiction suggests a person's attempt to assert an identity in circumstances designed to erase it. When archaeologists publish these finds, they caution against literal readings. The marks are fragmentary, ambiguous. Yet the cumulative pattern is telling. The scratched lines and the ledgers together suggest that persons were both catalogued and attempted to be remembered in the same spaces where the state sought to neutralize them. We must be precise about what the sources say and what they imply. Ancient chroniclers describe cases and use language that modern readers find shocking, but these accounts are often embedded in other agendas, moral critique, political sniping, or rhetorical flourish. Archaeological data give us the infrastructure and material context, but rarely speak with explicit moral commentary. Scholarship fills the remaining gap. Historians infer patterns from repeated administrative structures, from correlations between ledger fragments and space layouts, and from literary references that, taken together, delineate a bureaucratic practice. Where the evidence is fragmentary, I will say so. Where it converges, the implication grows stronger. This convergence produces a disturbing conclusion. The transfer of captives after spectacles was not always ad hoc. There were moments when reward systems, administrative accounting, and physical infrastructure coalesced into what can be described as an organized practice. The empire's appetite for spectacle required constant supply chains of animals, props, and human performers and victims. And these supply chains were managed through paperwork, through corridors, and through the logic of exchange. Gladiators existed partly as instruments of control, but they also functioned as actors within a market that normalized the distribution of captives. The moral ambiguity surrounding gladiators complicates the picture. Many of them were enslaved, yet a subset could become celebrities, winning fame and occasional privileges. That ambivalence allowed the state to present the spectacle as a meritocratic theater, victory rewarded, skill admired, while ensuring that the machinery that supplied rewards remained intact. A man raised to heroism in the arena could be the very agent who, by the structure of reward, benefited from the dispossession of others. The literature captures this tension, admiration for bravery entwined with the acceptance of brutal normalcy. To render the human cost without sensationalism, we turn to reconstruction anchored in fragments. A captive woman arriving from a border town would be processed, formally recorded, temporarily housed in underground chambers, then sent to a centralized depot where her fate would be decided by officials, sponsors, or the results of spectacles. Ledger entries suggest occasional marks of sale, of transfer, of assignment. Graffiti and the ruins of private quarters hint at resistance. Attempts to carve a self into stone or to hide small mementos. These acts, small, often anonymous, are the only traces of agency available to us. They tell us how people resisted erasure in ways both subtle and stubborn. There are also legal traces. Roman administrative records, preserved in scattered papyri and referenced by jurists, indicate the state's role in regulating spoils and managing public property. When the state claimed captives as public booty, their disposal could be subject to official control. In some cases, local elites and officials exercised discretion. In others, the disposals were standardized. Modern historians point to examples where policy and practice diverged. Laws claiming to protect, administrators finding ways to profit. These contradictions are familiar in imperial systems, but here they had particularly intimate consequences. Listen to a plausible reconstruction of a domestic scene within the ludus. A trainer moves among fighters, his palms stained with oil and sand. He speaks in clipped phrases about upcoming games and allocations. A ledger is passed under the doorway, names whispering across the threshold of life and loss. The trainer's face is not monstrous, he is pragmatic. This is important. The machinery of oppression is often run by ordinary, procedural minds, not caricatures of evil. Recognizing that helps explain how such a system becomes normalized. As the investigation deepens, patterns continue to repeat. Festival calendars align with entries in ledgers. Spatial analysis of hypogea shows repeatable pathways for the movement of people. The rhetorical corpus of satirists and moralists echoes practices that otherwise vanish into bureaucratic silence. Together, these vectors form a constellation that supports the claim. The allocation of captives as rewards, including those involving sexual violence, was embedded in the administrative and cultural logic of spectacle. This is an area where moral clarity is necessary. Naming what happened is not the same as reducing it to a provocation for modern outrage. Instead, the aim is to hold memory for those who were stripped of it, to refuse the complacent admiration of monuments that bury inconvenient truths. There is also an ethical caution in the way we describe these acts. The goal is to document and to humanize, not to recreate trauma for curiosity. When I describe assignment or distribution, I mean to draw attention to the systems that enabled abuse, not to provide prurient detail. The climax of the evidence is architectural and documentary working in concert. Picture the above-ground Colosseum bright with sun and applause. Underfoot, the hypogea's gates swing open and close like the cogs of a machine. Ledgers in nearby offices mark names in cold ink. Sponsors arrange spectacle, objects, and persons alike. This triad, space, paper, and performance, constitutes infrastructure, a set of durable arrangements that made certain forms of violence routine. If the stones could speak, they would not tell a story of a few monstrous acts, but of normalization by administration. Above the underground corridors, modern tourists circle the arena taking photographs. The marble facade gleams. The past is packaged into a postcard. The contrast could not be starker. Where the sunlight strikes columns and banners, there is choreography of memory. Below, damp stones keep an older ledger of accounting and erasure. This is not merely a matter of historical curiosity. The way societies remember is political. Monuments can celebrate skill in engineering, and yet the same walls can hide the routines of harm that sustained their making. At the end of this segment of the investigation, two responsibilities remain. First, to preserve the dignity of the people whose lives appear in these records. When possible, we refer to them collectively: captives, conquered women, because inventing names would be an act of narrative appropriation. Second, to be exact about evidentiary limits. Some claims are strongly supported by converging sources. Others remain interpretive, contested among scholars. When I point to ledger entries suggesting allocation, I am pointing to an archival practice that, when combined with space and rhetoric, leads to a probable institutional pattern. Where the textual evidence is rhetorical or fragmentary, I have flagged the claim as inference. There is more to follow: a closer look at specific ledger fragments, testimony from ancient chroniclers with context and caution, and the voices of the archaeologists who uncovered the Hypogea. We will examine a case study that stitches a single ledger entry to physical space and to a known festival, to show, step by step, how the machinery operated. We will also consider the ethical work of memorialization. How do we, centuries later, hold memory without spectacle? Music fades. Pause for effect. Check sources. Ledger fragments from Hypogea excavations. References to satiric poets and legal papyri. Archaeological reports on Hypogea dimensions. The case study begins with a fragment no larger than a palm, its edges frayed and softened by centuries of handling and burial. Under the incandescent lamp of the conservation table, the ink sits like a fossilized vein. Quick strokes of a stylus pressed into prepared hide, a shorthand of names reduced to initial and mark. The fragment bears a sponsor's mark, an emblem worked into the margin, and beneath it a sequence of notations, terse, repetitive, and punctuated by a symbol that, elsewhere in the archive, appears next to allotments of animals and objects entrusted to the arena's masters. Marcus, the papyrologist on the team, traced the hand with a gloved finger and read aloud in a voice deliberately neutral: A, I, V, with sign. The letters could be initials, the marks a ledger code. On their own, they tell little. In relationship to place, they become legible. That is the project of the investigation: to move from isolated artifact to infrastructure, from a single abbreviation to an administrative practice. The ledger fragment's date was not given in ink, but in context. Coins found in the same sealed layer, diagnostic pottery sherds, and a cross-cutting deposit beneath a stone stair all converged on a narrow window of decades. Radiocarbon samples from a billet of rope trapped beneath the ledger storage bundle gave a margin that tightened. The fragment belonged to a run of ledgers kept in an office adjacent to the amphitheater. The office's foundation abutted an entrance whose threshold bore tool marks that matched movement wear described in contemporary manuals of maintenance. In short, the paper, the place, and the path came together. Spatial analysis turned the ledger's shorthand into a map. The team reconstructed the Hypogeum's circuits, a series of holding niches, numbered doors, and a corridor that ran parallel to the paternal loggia. One stair descended from the manager's office to a service corridor. The corridor's floor bore scraping that corresponded to wheeled carts mentioned in a papyrus inventory of festival supplies. When they compared the ledger's marginal codes to incised numerals on the corridor's lintels, the match was unmistakable. Marks repeated in sequence, as if a clerk had checked them off during procession. The ledger's sign thus read not merely as a notation of possession, but as an administrative stamp marking movement and allocation. Ancient chroniclers provide a second thread. Where ledger and stone meet in the archive, the rhetoricians and moralists of the day supply texture, not documentary proof, but a cultural context. Satiric lines that mock the showman's trophy lists and legal petitions that complain about abuses during games do not name practices with our modern specificity. They mock and legalize, accuse and lampoon. Yet when read together with ledgers and hypogea, their jests harden into testimony. A poet's aside about the clerk who counts who is to be shown acquires weight when found near an account entry that tallies an allocation for a sponsor's favor. The poets do not replace the ledger, they illuminate the norms that made such entries thinkable. For archaeologists, these convergences matter because they change probability into a plausible narrative. The ledger entry alone remains ambiguous, perhaps a notation of debt, perhaps a recording of freedom granted, perhaps something else. The hypogeum's architecture alone suggests channels of movement but not their purpose. The satirists alone mock without documentation. Together, however, they produce a pattern: temporal alignment of festivals with peaks in ledger activity, repeated mark systems across offices, physical features in underground spaces designed for controlled transfer. What emerges is less the certainty that any given individual was assigned as property, and more the structural logic that made assignment routine and administrable. Yet at every stage, the team insists on restraint. The language of the report carefully uses collective descriptors: captives, conquered persons, those detained for display, because to invent names would be to fabricate lives in the absence of consent. The ledger's handwriting does not yield a face. A line slant will not tell a child's age. Where the archival record suggests an allocation, the report frames it as institutional practice supported by convergent evidence, rather than as a forensic narrative of single victims. Respectful restraint governs not only analysis but presentation. That ethical posture extends to the questions of display and public engagement. The conversation in the conservation tent is practical and urgent. What do we do with the fragment? A ledger fragment cannot be simply catalogued and shelved forever. It is evidence that speaks to civic memory. Yet how it speaks matters. To mount the original in a glass case with explanatory text that enumerates the horrors could reproduce the same spectacle that the ledgers helped administer. The museum, like the amphitheater in antiquity, could turn suffering into attraction. Several models of commemoration were debated. One option, high-resolution facsimiles for display, with the original stored under controlled conditions and accessible only for research. The facsimile would be accompanied by interpretive panels that center the ledger's human consequences without prurience. The administrative processes, the range of possible experiences, and the limits of inference. Another option favored an audio-driven intervention. Short testimonies from historians, archaeologists, ethicists, and community members that play in a quiet, contemplative space. Yet another proposed a restrained architectural solution, a memorial courtyard adjacent to the museum where visitors encounter elemental cues, steps, thresholds, inscriptions, without theatrical reconstruction. Included in these considerations was an insistence on consultation. The ledger is not the property of a distant institution alone. Its display implicates contemporary communities whose heritage is entangled with the site. The team proposed public fora and meetings with municipal representatives, local historians, and groups who might be affected by the presence of such material. Decisions about display, language, and interpretation must not be unilateral. Institutional caution, in this view, is not a mere bureaucratic hesitation, but a form of witness to the ledger's moral weight. There are technical choices, too, that shape ethical outcomes. The conservation process itself can be done in ways that foreground care rather than spectacle. Instead of a conservation reveal designed for publicity, the ledger stabilization work proceeded in a closed lab, documented for posterity, and made available to the public via controlled digital surrogates. These surrogates allow visitors to zoom in to ink strokes and marginalia without exposing the original to light or touch. Digital access democratizes evidence while preventing the original from becoming an exhibit of suffering. The team's next move was to follow a particular ledger thread through multiple repositories. A second fragment, discovered in a different office dump, carried a corresponding code and a marginal note: for the patron of the third gate, festival of the season. When mapped against the recorded festivals, those days when the arena's calendar swelled, the ledger marks clustered around 3 narrow ceremonial windows in the year. These were not random assignments. They were scheduled events embedded in the liturgical and civic calendar, aligning administrative practice with public-facing ritual. Field notes from the excavation reveal additional human traces that complicate the ledger's cold lines. A narrow cell whose floor is worn at knee height suggests frequent kneeling. The footpath between holding niches bears particulate residues consistent with packed straw, and in one corner, a small amulet fragment, an object hasty or desperate to retain personal meaning. None of these findings solves the ledger's questions, but they humanize the spaces where administrative practices met live-in bodies. Scholars of law and custom contributed another strand. Legal papyri show petitions filed by those who sought redress after games, by managers accused of embezzlement, and by freed persons claiming their liberty. The law, where it intervened, often did so unevenly. Some petitions sought restitution not for bodily harm, as we would frame it, but for loss of property or social standing. These documents remind us that ancient legal categories differ from modern ones. They also show that the administrative apparatus had pathways, however imperfect, for complaint and for regulating spectacle. The ledger's entries existed within that contested legal ecology. At the end of the week, with the lamp's light dimming and the conservator packing tools into their case, the team gathered for a final reading. Marcus laid the fragment in its sleeve, his gloved hands deliberate. Amrita, who had directed the fieldwork, spoke not as a scientist cataloging data, but as someone who had spent hours in damp corridors listening to the stones. "We cannot make this into a moral tale for our own satisfaction," she said. "We must keep our language precise and our humility intact. The ledger shows a system. It does not replace the lives it records." That humility framed the next procedural step, a consultative meeting with municipal archivists, museum curators, and representatives from civic groups. The room where they met looked over the plaza that feeds visitors to the amphitheater. Tourists drifted in clusters below, some laughing, some posing against the sunlit columns. The contrast between exterior spectacle and interior ledger remained a live image, part of the point they were trying to make about public memory. There was no consensus in the meeting, only careful pluralities. Some argued for a solemn installation that acknowledges the ledger's complicity in patterns of harm. Others feared that any display would itself become a new spectacle. In the end, the group agreed on a phased approach. A temporary closure of the artifact to public display, while a broader interpretive plan was drafted. The creation of accessible digital surrogates and a public series that explained methodology and evidence, and, crucially, a community convening to guide the language used in any future exhibition. The ledger was placed in a controlled case and transported to the repository. Its sleeve whispered against cardboard as it slid into a drawer. For a while, it would be research material, not display. The move felt like a small ethical victory, an affirmation that evidence should be handled with deliberation. But it was only the beginning. The ledger's lines still demanded interpretation, and the site still demanded a politics of memory that refused easy reconciliation. Outside, the amphitheater's marble soaked in late light. The stones held the silence of tourists' footfalls and the residue of centuries of spectacle. In the repository, paper and ink waited under soft filtered light. Between those two places, a plaza full of smiles and a drawer full of notations, lay all the decisions yet to be made. How to tell the story without making it a show. How to honor those whose lives flicker in shorthand. How to turn administrative fragments into a lasting commitment to truth and dignity. The work of translation, archaeological, archival, ethical, would proceed slowly, and it would require voices beyond the laboratory. For now, the ledger rested. The questions it raised continued to move through the team's hands and minds, shaping the next steps of research and remembrance. The convening took place 3 weeks later in a municipal hall whose glass facade caught the low winter sun. Amrita arrived early, carrying a satchel of photocopies and a small binder of transcriptions. Marcus followed, slower, as if measured steps could steady the unease that had not left him since the ledger's sleeve slid into the drawer. The room filled with people whose faces belonged to different publics, archivists and curators in neat jackets, municipal officers with name badges, neighbors who had grown up beneath the amphitheater's shadow, organizers from a survivor rights collective, a retired performer who had once danced in the plaza during summer festivals, and 2 young students from the local university whose research had been cited in the project's call for participation. Amrita opened the meeting without flourish. She laid out the aims: transparency, community guidance, and co-creation of any public interpretation. Then she let others speak. The first to stand was Sophia, a coordinator from a civic memory group. Her voice was low and steady. "We are not asking for an exhibit that simply reproduces the ledger," she said. "We want a process that acknowledges harm, names structures, and gives space to voices that were erased. That means decisions about display, language, and access must be shared." She proposed a working committee that included residents, descendants where identifiable, activists, and academics. A council archivist, Tomas, answered cautiously. He reminded everyone of legal constraints: unredacted names, privacy laws for modern descendants, and the need for careful provenance. "We cannot release personal data without due process," he said, "but we can create narratives that do not require exposing private identities." An older man in the back, who had been silent until then, rose with a tremor in his hands. He introduced himself as Marco, once a tour guide who had learned the amphitheater's history by reciting polished anecdotes. He spoke of the weight of inherited spectacle. "We have been selling a story of glory," he said, "without naming the cost. People who come here leave lighter in their steps because they only see theater, not the ledger's handwriting." He asked, could the tours be altered to include a moment of remembrance, a pause when guides speak of the ledger and the lives it hints at? The survivor rights organizers were firmer. Livia, a lawyer and activist, spoke of restitution in material terms, support for educational programs in neighborhoods most affected by the histories revealed, and public acknowledgement that the state had profited from spectacle and incarceration. "We need more than words on a plaque," she said. "We need commitments, funding, curricula, access to records for families who want to."
Trace lineage. Her tone drew nods and a few quick, uncomfortable glances toward Tomas. Marcus listened in a way that felt like a physical action. He inhaled and catalogued the shape of each argument. When it was his turn, he did not offer policy so much as a reading. He opened the binder and read aloud one ledger line. Not a name, not a sensational detail, but a notation that had stayed with him. An entry accounting for a tunic paid to a man who did not return to his family's household. The small ledger clause, an inventory line among columns, became suddenly human in the room's silence. "That could be any of thousands," Tomas interjected, but the silence had already shifted. Marcus continued. He described, plainly, the economy hinted out by the ledger: payments for costumes and cages, deductions for injuries, credits for returned animals, fines levied against managers. He said, without theatricality, "This is not only accounting, it is a record of bodies and loss within an economy of display." Ambrita closed the binder gently. "We do not have a full story," she said. "We have tracings. What we must refuse is making the ledger into spectacle again, into something that simply draws tourists to gasp and move on. We must also refuse secrecy that excludes living stakeholders." She proposed a phased path forward that reflected the meeting's earlier consensus and its divergences: a transparent digitization that protected personal data, a public education strand developed with local schools and community groups, a physical interpretive installation that would be modest, reflective, and co-created, and a reparative fund seeded by a portion of ticket revenue and municipal contributions to be governed by a committee with community representatives. The room thrummed with debate over governance and detail. Who would sit on the committee, what constituted adequate anonymization, whether the cartographic reproduction of the ledger's columns should be displayed. The university students pressed for full open access to the digital corpus for scholarly work. Livia insisted that access protocols include oversight and that pathways be created for descendants to petition for fuller disclosure when they could demonstrate a legitimate claim. Marco asked for a simple memorial stone in the plaza to slow the footfalls of those who had walked past for centuries. By evening, the convening had not produced unanimity, but it had produced a roadmap. They agreed on the committee's first tasks: to draft principles of interpretation, to commission a designer adept in non-sentimental memorial practices, to convene listening sessions in 3 neighborhoods, and to pilot a classroom pack for local secondary schools using anonymized ledger extracts. The municipal council pledged initial funding for digitization and public programming, conditional on the committee's recommendation for long-term governance. Back at the repository that night, Marcus sat with the ledger under the lamp. He traced a margin with his finger, as if the paper might answer in the way a human does. The conservation report awaited revision. The digital imaging team would arrive the next morning. He felt, absurdly,
like a midwife waiting for a process that was not strictly his. Amrita called from the doorway. She had stayed to organize logistics and to leave an envelope of notes for the digitization staff. "You did well," she said. Marcus did not know how to take the praise. "We," he corrected, nodding toward the covered drawer. "You read something people needed to hear," she said. "Not to grandstand, just to make the ledger audible." Her voice softened. "Listen, there will be backlash. There will always be those who fear that acknowledging harm erodes tourism, that public memory is better left tidy. That is why we are doing the hard part, making messy decisions before the cameras pick up anything." The imaging process was meticulous and slow. The team built a light frame that allowed raking light to reveal impressions the naked eye missed. A graduate student, Noor, worked at the scanner and discovered an ink abrasion that suggested a correction. Someone had struck through an entry and annotated it in a smaller hand. Amrita and Marcus leaned in. The corrected line did not reveal names, but it altered the ledger's logic. Where a tally had stood firm, now a subtraction and a terse note suggested a reversal. Perhaps a debt forgiven, perhaps an official reclassification. Small gestures like this turned the ledger from a static accounting into a palimpsest of decisions. Noor proposed the inclusion of these layers in the public surrogates, with a clear legend about what readings were tentative. Marcus insisted on footnotes that emphasized uncertainty. The digitization would provide high-resolution images, transcriptions, and a moderated public commentary interface, where community members could ask questions and submit local knowledge. The server hosting the surrogates would live under the municipal archives domain, with an editorial board including civil society representatives to oversee access requests. Weeks became months. Listening sessions gathered in humble neighborhood halls and in the ornate library atrium, in after-school centers and the church hall where Marco had once rehearsed choruses. People brought memories and refusals. A woman whose grandfather had been a stonemason claimed with pride that his work had made the amphitheater possible. She wanted recognition for labor, not only for spectacle's victims. A small group of performers argued that the amphitheater's history included both coercion and craft, that not every actor had been only a victim, and that the ledger's lines should be read in the complexity of human agency. A survivor rights group insisted on the primacy of testimony and reparative action. Some residents feared that a focus on past harms would stigmatize their neighborhoods anew. Others argued it might mobilize resources long withheld. Through it all, Amrita insisted on process. Listen, document, deliberate. Marcus found himself writing a public brief that tried to hold together competing claims without dissolving them into platitudes. He drafted language that acknowledged complicity without singling out individuals who could not answer. He argued for interpretive frames that centered structural analysis, how economies of spectacle intersected with governance, how legal practices categorized bodies in ways that facilitated harm. Designers proposed a lowered glass case in the new interpretive space, not to display the ledger itself, but to hold an illuminated facsimile alongside contextual panels and a bench. The real ledger would remain in the repository, accessible to researchers under agreed protocols. The facsimile would be a sensory object that invited quiet attention. Nearby, a wall would list categories, the ledger's headings, translated into plain language with short commentaries about what each column meant for a life. The designers suggested an audio element, anonymous, short voices reading ledger lines intercut with reflections from descendants, scholars, and performers, an oral palimpsest. One evening, as snow made the amphitheater's marble white and muffled the city's hum, the working committee met to finalize the interpretive brief. Livia pushed for a clause that the municipality commit a portion of ticket revenue for 10 years to community education and restitution initiatives. Tomas argued for a pilot year and review. Marco lobbied for a simple plaque that would be installed in the plaza by the main stairway, a brief text acknowledging the ledger and inviting reflection. Sophia, who had learned to navigate compromise as a craft, proposed a dual statement, a public plaque and an annual remembrance event designed by the committee. Amrita read the draft aloud. Each clause carried the weight of months of conversation. When she reached the line about the reparatory fund, a murmur rose. People shifted in their seats as if to make room for a new moral geography. "We cannot fix the ledger in law," she said, "but we can use it to direct resources differently. That is a beginning, not an end." Marcus thought of the ledger's cold margins and the narrow cell whose floor bore the imprint of knees. He thought of the amulet fragment found in a corner and of the conservationist's gloved hands. He had entered archaeology because he loved the slow logic of things, yet now he understood that slow work could not be an excuse for evasion. Objects called for remedies that were not only scholarly. The committee voted, with one abstention and the rest in favor, on the interpretive brief and on the committee's governance model. They resolved to pilot the facsimile installation in the museum's quiet wing, to begin the digitization with a public launch that would foreground the process and the committee's role, and to convene an independent review after 18 months. On the day of the digitization's public launch, the museum set up chairs in a wing that looked onto the amphitheater. The facsimile lay under soft light. Projection screens showed the ledger's high-resolution pages, annotated live by scholars who explained techniques and cautions. Marcus spoke about the ledger's limits and potentials. Livia spoke of reparation as accountability. Marco read the plaque text aloud and, with a tremor he had once hidden behind practiced cheer, dedicated the memorial to those whose handwriting had been reduced to columns. People listened and left in slower patterns. Some hovered by the facsimile, and tourists who had once posed on the marble steps paused at the plaque and, for the first time, bent their steps toward the repository's windows as if seeking the faces of those whose lives the ledger had occluded. The ledger remained, as it had been, an artifact that did not answer everything and that required careful stewardship. But it had prompted a series of actions, small institutional reforms, the commitment of resources, an educational initiative co-designed with neighbors, that altered the amphitheater's public choreography. It had also changed the team. Marcus found that his work had shifted from the solitary discipline of close reading to the more complicated labor of listening and public accountability. Amrita continued to bind process to principle, refusing both spectacle and silence. As winter gave way to spring, the amphitheater's marble warmed, and tourists returned. The plaque's letters glinted in new light. The repository's drawer remained closed most days, but the digital surrogates were visited by scholars and citizens alike. Comments arrived, some grateful, some scathing, all part of a public conversation that could no longer be contained by tidy narratives. At night, Marcus sometimes walked the plaza alone. He would sit on a bench and watch light strike the amphitheater, watch a child run a lane of shadow, and then stop, turn, and laugh. The ledger's pages were not the only things that recorded human lives. The plaza did too. In footsteps, in the set of shoulders moving past a tour group, in the discarded flyer that wind carried like a small white sail. He had once believed that the job of the archive was to sort and to explain. He had come to see that it was also to summon responsibility. There were still debates to come about which employees would be trained to handle sensitive requests, about whether the memorial event should include a formal apology from municipal representatives, about how to adjudicate claims from descendants seeking fuller disclosure. There would be press, and there would be critics who accused the project of overreach or of yielding to political pressure. None of that surprised Amrita. Beyond the project's tactical concerns, she kept returning to a simpler measure: whether the process honored the ledger's human traces in ways that allowed communities to act. She and Marcus agreed on one modest practice. For every exhibition season, one night would be reserved for a quiet reading, an evening where the facsimile would be lit and certain ledger lines read aloud by members of the community. No spectacle, no publicity, only attention. The ledger's architecture, its columns, strike-throughs, and marginal notes would be treated as a text to be heard, not merely shown. When the first reading was scheduled, the museum closed the facsimile room at dusk and left a single lamp burning. A small group gathered, some committee members, some neighbors, 2 students, a curator, and an older woman who had once worked in a laundry whose
house had faced the amphitheater. She read in a voice that carried the plainness of ordinary life. She read an entry that recorded a payment, then paused and said, "Let us remember they were names, even when written as sums." No one needed to explain what she meant. Outside, the lamp cast a narrow circle on the ledger's facsimile. Inside the repository, the original rested in its drawer, its sleeve tucked like a quiet thing that had been entrusted to hands that would not be reckless. The city around them continued to hum. Tourists still posed on steps, workers still swept the plaza. The ledger's lines had not simplified the world, but had become a hinge through which the city's memory could open a little wider. An imperfect hinge, but one that moved. The work would continue. The decisions already made would be tested. New evidence might complicate old assumptions. The ledger itself, stubborn and banal, would keep offering marginal corrections, faint smudges, and the occasional overwritten numeral that demanded another reading. The team knew they had no final answers to offer, only practices. Careful language, shared governance, and an insistence that material traces of the past ought not to be handed back to the public as entertainment, but to be held as invitations to care. That winter's reading ended quietly. People drifted into the plaza and went their ways beneath the amphitheater's arches. Marcus lingered a moment, feeling the drafts that came off the marble like a city's slow breath. He thought of the narrow cell, the amulet fragment, the ledger sleeve sliding into its drawer. None of them was a solution. They were, instead, prompts, objects that required action, not piety. He walked back toward the repository door, the plan for the next year's committee meeting in his pocket, the ledger's soft rustle a reminder that histories do not rest in silence when they are properly heard.